The issue of child labor has been an issue that is debatable. You know, people are like, how do you categorize this as child labor? Surely, this is my child.
Wash the dishes, man.
I'm training them the ways of the world. That's not labor. It's training. It's chores. How do you call chores labor? But then there are areas where it's actually considered child labor, right? And then there are areas as well where you think about and you actually don't see it, but there's trafficking that's happening in the country. And we talk about trafficking and thinking, okay, trafficking is when people are being, promised jobs abroad, and then they land there, and then they find themselves being shipped to some place where they're locked up and they're not able to. There's trafficking that's happening in country, okay? And we are joined by two people now who are going to help us with this conversation. They are from the International Labour Organization, ILO. Andrew Odete is Engagement and Partnership Building Officer at the ILO CAPSA project, while Grace Banda is the project manager for the ILO CAPSA project. Good morning, Grace. Good morning, Andrew.
Morning.
Good morning.
How are you doing?
Very well.
Welcome to the hot seat of the Situation Room.
Thank you.
Good to have you both here.
We're happy to be here.
Very good.
I listen to you people every day, so happy to be in your room.
You're here, and you're happy. Karibu sana. Karibu sana. You're going to tell us a lot more, and this is going to be an engaging one on what is, child labor and what's trafficking, and so on and so forth. But first, you'll listen to CT's proverb. This week, CT, in which country are we? Give them a hint.
Why don't I give our guests a little hint so that they can exercise their knowledge of the lack of it thereof in geography. Okay? This country has many neighbors. One of the neighbors is Ethiopia. The other neighbor is Tanzania. There's a neighbor called Uganda, South Sudan, and the Indian Ocean. Which country is this?
Andrew?
This sounds like Kenya.
It sounds like Kenya.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, some people may confuse it like with Kenya. That has happened before.
Those people exist. And you join their ranks. Well done.
I think I also want to agree that it could be Kenya. Sounds like Kenya. Because we have...
it is Kenya.
Yes.
Let me stop yanking your chain. It is Kenya. Yes, our proverbs for the whole of this week will be from the country of Kenya. We've been looking at countries south of the Sahara, north of the Limpopo. And yes, the proverbs are in Kiswahili. And for those who understand Kiswahili, we'll ask you to give us an interpretation of it, first of all, in English, then the meaning as you understand it.
Okay.
Chui hakumbatiwi.
Chui hakumbatiwi.
Yes.
Andrew?
So you don't hug a leopard. That is the translation, I believe.
First of all, 9 is going to be very difficult because...
Don't worry, sister.
So you'll forgive me here
even in Uganda,
yes,
they speak Swahili.
Chui, at least I know is a leopard.
Very good, you see.
Hakumbatiwi. It is hugging. So you definitely, no one ever dares hug a leopard.
So what did you want us to excuse you from? And you understand the proverb perfectly.
Maybe because Andrew spoke earlier. I got the hint.
What's the interpretation of it, Grace?
Okay. I think you'd be looking for trouble, surely, to even think of hugging something like a leopard, leave alone anybody who is near what leopards do. I think I leave it at that.
I would agree, yeah. I think a dangerous situation is not one you run to. It is a situation you want to avoid. In fact, if you are going to hug a leopard, probably you should have a weapon or claws that are sharper than its own. Yeah.
Okay. You're both right. Absolutely right. And you've interpreted it very well. Thank you.
Thank
Yes,
you.
indeed.
Thank you so much.
Yes, indeed. What's the CAPSA project by the ILO?
CAPSA is the short of a long name that stands for Strengthening of Capacities of Government to address issues of child labor, forced labor, human trafficking, which is essentially the original project that we've been implementing in Uganda and Kenya. And this project is coming to an end. We've implemented it for the last 5 years. We also have some aspects of work that we do at the East Africa community level through the Department of Youth, Gender and Social Services. So basically it's an acronym, a short for a longer name.
Quite long.
Yes.
It starts with strengthening, and the CAPSA is C.
Yes.
Like
That's
how do you
one.
like strength?
It's one of those things that we can't explain, but we know when we refer to it with our partners, they know what
They
we're
all
talking-
understand
So
what it
it's
is.
the C, mainly the capacity strengthening that stands out.
So what have you been doing throughout the life of this project? I mean, what was it all about?
Good question.
Because you're strengthening the capacities of your partners.
So we, first of all, the ILO, the International Labour Organization, is the oldest UN agency. We've celebrated more than 100 years of existence, established after the Second World War, after the Depression, to cater for labor rights. So the ILO was set up to set standards for labor. And so it's a membership, one of the only UN agencies that is a membership agency. For example, Kenya is the member of the ILO. And so the mandate to establish labor standards is actually done at all levels with countries and the ILO. So, and these are translated into what we call conventions. I'm sure you've heard about conventions. And so when we work in countries, our mandate or our role is to actually support countries to continuously remain compliant to the ILO conventions, which are translated further down to national policies and laws. And so part of what we've been doing in this project is also to identify the laws of the two countries, Uganda and Kenya, and try to ascertain where there are gaps and help the countries to fill the gaps, but also to update their laws and policies in alignment with the international labor standards. So that's one area. The other one has also been because these laws and policies are implemented by institutions that work on these issues. So strengthening the capacities of institutions to be able to enforce the laws, first and foremost, but also to implement the policies. It's one thing having a policy, it's another implementing it to benefit the children, especially our target group, but also communities to be able to understand why they shouldn't be sending their underage children to work, and the importance of education, social protection, and the services, especially for those who have been rescued from these situations of child labor, forced labor, and trafficking cases. So the service providers who provide shelter, psychosocial counseling skills, even food and clothing, because oftentimes you've seen children begging on the street. You ask yourself, who are they and why are they not in school when others are in school? So those kinds of situations is what we've been involved in. But much more than working at national level, we also go to the subnational level. For example, we have worked in a few target counties in Kenya to work with the communities, but also the government officers that work at that level, again, to ensure that they first of all know the existing policies? Are they implementing them? Where the laws need to be enforced, are they aware? The labor officers that inspect workplaces, children's officers who deal directly with children, and then civil society organizations. They are the ones that mainly provide the services to victims and survivors. Andrew could also speak about.
Andrew, so our topic for today is the sorry state of child labor and trafficking in Kenya. Let's start with the definition. So we are all on the same page. What is child labor in the context of Kenya?
Child labor means different things to different people. The global definition under the ILO is work that is harmful to children. So work that affects them morally, physically, emotionally, and takes them out of school. And also work that affects their future well-being. So you also mentioned, because it's very key to differentiate between what they call child work or sometimes light work and child labor. You mentioned that children should do some form of work at some point. Everybody should, as they learn to be upstanding citizens of the world. And as we nurture them into adults who are productive in their community. But the big question is, where do you draw the line between child labor on the one hand and child work or light work on the other hand? And to determine whether something amounts to child labor, one then needs to consider a number of dynamics. How old is the child that's being deployed to undertake this work? If you give a 14-year-old child 10 spoons to wash, 10 spoons and some knives to wash, probably even to mop a room in a house, it's so different. On the other hand, if you give that kind of work to a 7-year-old, so age matters. Is it affecting their schooling? Is it work that has been contracted when they should be in school? Whether it is just 2 shirts they're washing, but is it affecting their schooling? Is it also, children are children, is it affecting their leisure? They need time to rest. They need time to sleep. In many societies, we believe that because our fathers, our grandparents did some work, such as fishing, I'll give the example of omena, which is fished late in the night. And many people will tell you, my father took me to fish in the night with lights because that's what attracts the flies that then come and the fish come out. Was that child supposed to be asleep at that time in readiness for school the following day? So there are certain things that you need to consider, and that is the age of the child, the number of hours. Is it more than 2 hours a day? The type of hours, are they working when they should be in school? The nature of the work, is it dangerous work? Knives for a child of 8 years old, and also whether it is hazardous or not. Is it work in conditions that any child at all should not undertake? Are they working with heavy machinery? Are they working with chemicals? Are they working at heights? Are they working at depths? Are they mining? Are they carrying heavy loads? So that clears the line between child labor and child work on the other hand.
Can I ask Andrew if it actually does clear the line? Because I know we'll be getting some of these protections as we go along. But the lines seem to be a bit blurry, especially when we work against culture and tradition. Here in Africa, many would say that, well, the only way that you are going to be able to protect a legacy is if fathers and mothers showed their children trade. Right? And so at that time, they did not recognize or they did not acknowledge it as putting this child in a laborious situation. But what they did was to guarantee that when they grew up, they would have something that would protect them economically. So how do you draw the line then between waking up your 11-year-old son at night to go to the river to fish omena? Because if you do not do that, in your mind at that time, that is the economic activity that is going to help you, right? And your wisdom is asking that you give this to your children. So how do you draw the line and say, well, this child ought to be asleep? But the father is thinking, when this child is 20, 18, 25, they're going to need something, and the only way I can show them is practically. How do you draw those lines?
Thank you. And it's a subjective test normally, not an objective test. One kind of the parameters do not fit across the board. You have to look at the context, situation by situation. And I'd like to give the example of the COVID period, and particularly our neighbors in Uganda. For long swaths of time, schools closed. In Uganda, they closed for a continuous period of 2 years. So you can imagine what happened when schools were closed. Girls got pregnant. The boys went into work. Their parents were at home. They lost their jobs. But boys were so nimble. At under 18, they were riding boda. They had a taste for money before their time, and getting back to school was difficult. But they sustained their families during that time, and it was a dilemma. A parent sits at home. He or she has lost their source of livelihood because of COVID, but the child is still able to get some work and support the family. So where is the moral high ground to tell them that your only source of income cannot be sustained because it is a child who is responsible for bringing it? And I think that takes us to some of the root causes of child labor. Actually, the main one is poverty, economic situations that drive children into poverty. And more than a definitional issue, I think it is a question of how do we address child labor? It is for everybody, not just at family level. What can the government do? What can the society do? What can the social partners do? And that's where we come up with dynamics such as having a look at protection, such as social protection that can cover and cushion parents and families and vulnerable children against child labor. Access to free, compulsory, inclusive, and equitable education as well. How do you ensure that education is actually free and accessible and affordable so that these children coming from poor families who otherwise would be pushed into labor go to school, and other dynamics beyond that? Yeah.
There's some dynamics that are probably unforeseen, COVID being one of them, but before COVID there was HIV. Yeah. If you looked at communities that live around the lake, whether it's in Kenya or Uganda, many of the conventional bred earners, the adults, died. Yeah. So children were left either with very elderly grandparents or with adolescent siblings. And these people had to work. Yeah. There wasn't an option about it. And given just the number of people who were claimed by the scourge of HIV, the situation as it was, the one thing that was certain, you didn't have an easy solution to the problem. Because it was there and you really didn't know quite what you ought to do. Now, again, protection is important. Educating children is important. But why we are having this conversation in this day and age is what I want to ask. Because the protections didn't come in yesterday or the day before yesterday. Yet, we keep having this discussion. Why is it that it is impossible to get a handle of this problem and actually grind it to a halt? Why? Because on the one hand, ILO will come up with the things that they think would be able to help alleviate the situation, but it persists. Yeah. That's why the two of you are here.
Okay, that's a very good question, and thank you for raising it. Why do we continuously address this problem, and why isn't it going away? first of all, you talked about the issue of orphanhood. Orphanhood is actually, I think, comes second to poverty as a root cause to this phenomenon. Simply because when children are left on their own, they have to fend for themselves. They have to find food. They have to live and continue a life. So many of the children that are found, be it agriculture, fishing, hawking on the street, or even in domestic work, you will find maybe 9 out of 10 they will be orphans. They will have a background of having been left on their own or were given to some relative to take care of them, and they have found themselves in that situation. So the main reason why it keeps coming on is obviously we are not fighting poverty. Poverty keeps, it is one of the issues that remains with us, whether there's a pandemic, the difference or the poverty levels in all our sub-Saharan Africa countries continue to rise because of the economic situation that is in all the countries. So that has been either brought about by the governance issues in our countries. There's high levels of unemployment of adults. We have so many people out of work, and even those who are in work, what they have is not considered decent enough to provide for the needs of their families. We have very big families. Africans, we are producing many children that we cannot take care of. And so we find this continues. No matter how many programs or interventions we have, it is going to continue. And what we are finding is actually the face of child labor also changes. You fight it in tobacco, it will run to sugarcane plantations. From sugarcane, it will either go to coffee, and so it goes on and on. And then, of course, of late, we are also encountering other forms in the online, with this technology. I think children are actually being abused online. And that's also because it's considered a form of exploitation. Talk about coding, the young children who are given work to do, and they are focused on that, and it deprives them of continuously finishing or staying in school and finishing their education. So I don't think I have one answer to you to say this is the reason, but there are so many reasons. And tackling child labor also requires a multi-sectoral, multi-dimensional approach where you have to think of various ways. I think for me, what is top is that if the adults got decent work and it was decent enough to pay for all their needs, to cater for their families, there would be no need to send any child to work. That's one. Secondly, if we had solid social protection policies and programs, I think there's been an attempt to do what they call cash transfers. That is a short-term solution. You give poor families some monies every month, but they are producing more children. So while you're catering for a few of them, the others are being born and filling the spaces. But also, I think most of the East African, South African, Sub-Saharan Africa region have attempted to institute free compulsory primary education as one of the long-term answers to these problems, so that you have all children go to school. Education, they say, is an equalizer. So you compete, and those who are able to go through and get employment or even do other forms of trade so that you are able to earn an income. But we are finding that there are other hidden costs that the parents are not able to meet. So school uniform, you will not believe it, is one of those factors that sends children away from school.
Yeah.
Because no education program of any country will provide you a school uniform or even scholastic materials, books, pens, and those poor people are not able to afford them. So children drop out. Food. When Kajiado last week, in some of the communities, children just run to school because there's some kind of food. In their families, there's no food, and therefore they run to school. When the school is not able to provide, they won't go to school. For the girls, the menstrual periods send them out of school. So there's a lot more to look at when you're dealing with this issue.
Grace Banya and Andrew Odete from ILO CAPSA project, 20 minutes to 8. So I just want to throw in here an issue of trafficking, because you talked about child labor and it's still all up in the air. Trafficking, how do we define trafficking, Grace?
Yes, thank you. Trafficking includes recruitment, transportation, and harboring of human beings who are moved from one position or one location to another. And it always means that the person, or whether it's an adult or young person, does not consent to this whole idea of being moved from their one place to another. Oftentimes they are promised good life in the destination where they are being taken. For adults, we are finding many of those who are trafficked, it's either for jobs, employment, and obviously a promise of a better life. I'm sure you've heard about even Kenyans who are trafficked to the Gulf countries. And oftentimes we think trafficking involves people crossing borders from one country to the other, or actually being taken to another region. But the trafficking can be internal.
Okay, give us cases of child trafficking in Kenya.
Yes. There are cases, many cases. I possibly would not give you numbers of my fingers, but there are cases of children who are on the streets in Nairobi who have come from Tanzania, just your neighbor, or Uganda for that matter. I don't know whether you've heard, and possibly one of these days you'll invite us again to speak about a phenomenon of girls that have been trafficked from a region called Karamoja in the northern eastern part of Uganda that are found in a place called Isiri here in Nairobi, and they are being used in homes as domestic workers. So that's a very clear case.
How do they come here?
Interesting that you ask that question. How do they indeed come here? What we've been told, some of those we have interviewed, they cross the border, Busia border, and they come through buses, some in trucks, and whoever is behind the trafficking has promised them, a good life. They come for work. And so when they end here, how it actually turns into a case of trafficking, they run away from these places because, one, they're not paid. Two, because most are women. They are sexually abused, and you'll find they are pregnant. There are several cases of those who have had, we've seen with carrying babies. And some of our partners that run shelters actually do rescue them. Interestingly, when they are taken back to Uganda, they return in a few weeks or so. So it's a whole recruiting system. And going back to the definition, that's exactly what it is. That the recruiters warn them never to say who they are, because there's exchange of money, obviously, that is involved. But with regard to children who cross the borders from Tanzania, we also have worked around the Namanga border post. These are children who will cross, either they've come following grazing cows and they end up on the other side and they are not able to go back, or they are usually transported by the borders that cross them. Some of them are used to smuggle drugs and all kinds of things by adults. So yes, there is a big case here or issue of trafficking in Kenya.
Andrew, allow me to ask, we even with the campaigns, because there have been very many campaigns about stopping child trafficking, and usually it is to say stop child trafficking. But would we be able to look at it from a point of view of tighten the screws around the issues that would make individuals to traffic children, or that would make families to allow their children then to be taken? Economic issues, poverty issues, lack issues. Those are what we are talking about. Even the person who is trafficking, right? They are able to continue trafficking because in terms of security, in terms of making sure that the screws are tightened on things like corruption, those are not being done. Even in countries whereby trafficking may have been reduced, we'll find, and we can see that research has shown that precedent has been set, that there's 1, 2, 3 who've been arrested and charged and jailed. So the likelihood of another person doing it reduces significantly. So screws tightened there. We look at not making sure that all children who should be in school are in school. We look at making sure that parents who want to start businesses, for example, can do that. We look at people can get jobs. So if we tighten the screws on some of these things, don't we see that now this trafficking, because it happens as a result of all of these matters, all of these factors. If we tighten the screws around those elements, would we see that child trafficking then could reduce?
I agree, and I would say it's all the above. Efforts and interventions to end trafficking must both focus on preventive as well as redress, so that in the first place we ensure that the drivers, such as economic situations that push families to to collaborate, if you like, and being complicit in trafficking in persons, are addressed. But also, as you say, tighten the nuts so that the law enforcement agencies and other vigilant agencies are able, have capacity to detect trafficking, to stop it, to be able to investigate, to prosecute, to adjudicate, but also to provide protections and support for those who are survivors and victims of these violations. It's quite some ecosystem. You also say some people have been nabbed in the act, and that should be a deterrent. Funny how you'll find that it's rare that you catch the ringleader. Once in a while, they are prosecuted.
Yes.
But that's because trafficking has different limbs, and it's also advanced by many moving parts, including those that are oiled by corruption. It could be someone who has posted an advertisement that there is a job at a certain place. Then the victims are transported along a corridor. So it's also the transporter. When they get somewhere, they're harbored, they are put up in a facility, and then later on they are told, you know what? The job we wanted to give you is not yet available, but can you do this meanwhile? You are coming to wait on tables, but can you dance for the patrons at this club?
And that was the original intention.
Yeah, so the people who deploy you, so it's a long chain, but there's somebody hovering above there who is faceless and who is not on the ground and who is funding all this and who is lining the pockets of everybody along this corridor. So it's not an easy thing to detect. And many times you'll find that law enforcement would want to just harvest the low-hanging fruits and say, this person is in the country illegally. We are going to charge you with offenses related to that. Or you are loitering with intent. So we are going, but they don't go behind the scenes to try to unearth how did they get here in the first place. Yeah, and that's how sometimes you find that trafficking goes through the cracks. Yeah.
Do you have situations where young children, women, are actually taken against their will and transported to places where they then serve in conditions that are probably akin to slavery?
Yeah. The answer is yes. We have very many of those situations.
So they're abducted.
Well, yeah, you could call it that because, like Andrew was saying, the level of consent in these situations is also relative. Because if you've been told you're going to be taken to wait on tables and you end up in a brothel dancing and maybe serving the patrons of that facility, that's not what was originally the intention. And many cases of slavery, because say for example, I'll go back to the Karamajong girls example, where they're in houses, they have no say in whatsoever jobs they are given. They will work long hours, maybe no food at all, and they are not paid. So if there's anything that goes wrong, you just find your way, and that's how they are found after they've been thrown out of these households. So then they are loitering on the streets with babies begging, and they cannot speak the language here, so they are nabbed and maybe even repatriated back to the country. But you never know who was behind it. So yes, there are many cases, and we've seen most of them, but there are also those cases that are outside Kenya. I'm sure you've read in the papers, you've heard about the stories of the domestic workers who flock the Gulf countries. And either if you are lucky, you come back scarred, but most die and they throw themselves off buildings and things like that. So yes, they are forced to do what they were not even intended to do in the first place. This is now in the case of adults who are able to, even in many cases, go as if legally, because I think there's a phenomenon like labor exportation or something like that, where countries have agreed and they have signed bilateral labor agreements with country X, and they are saying, we'll send you a number of workers, and there are employment agencies that are involved. But that's another topic altogether. But if we focus on the issue of trafficking, we're looking at the illegality of it, but also the criminality of it, because it's really criminal.
But the real criminality is where all this begins. If people were not poor,
Yes.
because poverty renders you helpless. You actually even can't even make a decision on your own. Somebody's going to demand and make a decision for you.
Yes.
And on this continent, we seem to have accepted that some of us will be poor and that some of us will do exactly what we're saying. Because I'm saying this from the perspective that I do not see this coming to an end. There's an unless, of course, to it. But I don't see it coming to an end because it's not something that people seem to object to. Not really. Because in many cases, there are people who willingly allow their children or their relatives to be in this very situation that we are describing.
Yeah. And I agree with you to a large extent, because for as long as we have disparities between the rich and the poor, and there's no effort to bridge that gap, there's also the poverty of the mind, of not being really aware that could be a trafficking case where families and communities are giving away their children knowingly that they could end up in these situations. However, I think to say that it can't end and it will not end could also be a defeatist kind of, because I'm also thinking if you save even one person or two, you have saved lives.
Grace, there's an unless. I said there's an unless.
Yes.
Because you do not see this problem in countries where there is a strong push to ensure, one, that people actually get to go to school, children.
Absolutely.
Yes.
For example, if I can ask,
Please.
do we see children who are in school actively from January to December being trafficked?
No.
Exactly. The children who are being trafficked are not in school. Isn't it?
Agree.
So if the systems, for example, have been set up, like CT is saying, to ensure that every child of school-going age is actually in school, if we make sure that parents, families, guaranteed by government, have some form of economic activity that will guarantee shelter, food, clothing. Do we see people who are at least, I'm not even talking about well off, that are able to afford even 2 meals a day and a shelter? Do we see children from those homes being trafficked?
No, not at all. And precisely that's why we are saying if the laws and policies that exist are enforced, and what you're saying precisely is that all children are in school, they are monitored, that you report day one of first term, and you know if you are not in school for 2 weeks following, there's a concern and a follow-up. But is that happening? And that's why we're saying if everybody plays their role, even at the lower levels. For example, one of the activities or the interventions we have had with Uganda in some of the target districts, the communities decided to establish a bylaw in their community and say any family that will be found sending their children to the sugarcane plantations will be punished. So that's community taking the law into
enforcement.
Enforcement. And then districts are also developing ordinances. That is in Uganda. Here in Kenya, the counties that we've worked in, Kwale, Mombasa, Bungoma, Kajiado, they've also decided to develop their standalone child labor policies where they're saying this is zero tolerance to child labor. Last week we were in Mombasa, the governor has taken the lead. And
so what is it? So what are they doing about it? So it is zero tolerance to child labor, but the root cause is all known. Yes. Are they saying that we are now coming up with programs that will ensure there's social safety nets? For example, with Kwale, Bungoma, are they any of them saying that they're supporting families?
They are doing that. It's something that has been continuously happening with different partners, making sure that they are each other's keeper within the communities. They have child volunteers that go to the communities that report cases. Now, the families are on alert. It may not happen tomorrow, but there is at least an effort going into that direction.
Is there a program that is making sure that this family shall afford to buy uniform for their children when they're going to school, that this family shall be able to feed their children, or there is school feeding that will then attract the children to go to school? Because if you don't provide those, if you're not addressing the root cause, then all these are things of families monitoring one another. You're monitoring what? If my child has been sent home because of lack of school fees, monitor all you want.
I would agree, and I would agree. That question has been pondered and turned around so many times. The most famous and recent one is in 2022 when the Global Conference on the Elimination of Child Labor, and I say child labor because most people who are trafficked are deployed in labor. It was for the first time held on the African soil in Durban, South Africa, and the focus was on Africa. Why is it that so many years since we passed these conventions and started implementing actions, child labor and trafficking are still on the rise? And they came up with some pretty clear and targeted blueprints which go towards preventive and redress. And the first one was you need to ensure that the economic situation of communities is something that would ensure that they do not fall into these traps. So social protection, universal access to social protection. The other was access to education for all children. The other one was about data. We do not know, we cannot put our finger and tell you the magnitude or the sheer scale of child labor and trafficking, because we are not used to undertaking research and analyzing it to develop a better understanding of the problem we are dealing with. But this conference was also informed by studies that found that most children in child labor are in the agriculture sector. How have we been addressing issues there before? you asked what are they doing in these counties and what is the national government doing. The government of Kenya, through the Ministry of Labour and Social Protection and supported by the ILO, has a draft national policy on the elimination of child labour that takes in, among other targeted strategies, the Durban call to action that arose from the Durban meeting of 2022. And part of it is to ensure that there's social protection incrementally for children who are in need. So these things are being addressed. But there's also the component of financing for service provision and for administration of child labor. You'll find that many times it is left to a small ministry. I'm not saying small, but in terms of the budgetary allocation, the Ministry of Labor, and many times in many sub-Saharan countries, they are told, that is your monkey, deal with it. How can we ensure that there's a whole of government approach? If most children in child labor are in the agriculture sector, can we give greater mandates to these ministries also, and also the one of education, to have clear mandates to address child labor?
Thank you. Grace Banya, Project Manager, ILO, CAPSA, and Andrew Odete, Engagement and Partnerships Building Officer at ILO, CAPSA. They've been our guests talking about child labor and child trafficking in Kenya.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.